When people talk about America's victory in World War II, they usually start with battles, generals, and landings. These are the visible events. They are not the cause. The real advantage existed long before the first American soldier entered combat. It existed inside factories, schedules, and supply chains that were already built to scale. The United States did not enter the war as a military power. It entered as an industrial system. By 1941, American industry was not optimized for war. It was optimized for mass civilian consumption. That turned out to be the decisive factor. Factories did not need to be invented. They needed to be reassigned. Automobile plants became tank plants. Refrigerator lines began producing aircraft engines. The same conveyor logic remained. Only the output changed. This mattered because the system was already designed to run continuously. The core mechanism was not technology. It was shifts. American factories did not work harder. They worked without stopping. 3 shifts, fixed schedules, predictable output. While European factories shut down due to bombing, evacuation, power shortages, or labor collapse, American production continued through the night. No speeches, no improvisation, just repetition. This created an effect that combat could not offset: accumulation. Every aircraft produced did not merely replace a loss. It increased the total number in circulation. Germany and Japan treated equipment as assets to preserve. The United States treated equipment as consumables to reproduce. This difference changes the nature of war. When one side loses a plane and redesigns strategy to avoid future losses, and the other side loses a plane and schedules another one for delivery, the outcome stops being tactical. It becomes statistical. By 1942, American industry had not yet reached full capacity, but the direction was already irreversible. Even if campaigns failed, even if fronts stalled, even if mistakes were made, the production curve would continue upward. From that moment on, the war was no longer about who fought better. It was about who could replace faster than the enemy could destroy. And once that balance is fixed, defeat becomes a matter of time. The enemy simply has not realized it yet. War is usually described in space: fronts, distances, territory. But industrial war is decided in time. How long does it take to replace what was destroyed? For most countries, in World War II, the answer was measured in months. For the United States, it was measured in weeks, sometimes days. American factories were not optimized for peak performance. They were optimized for throughput, standardized parts, interchangeable components, fixed production cycles. This meant that a damaged aircraft was not a strategic loss. It was a scheduling problem. If a bomber failed to return, the question was not how to avoid this next time. The question was which production slot will replace it. This logic extended beyond factories. Raw materials arrived on predictable timetables. Rail networks moved components on fixed routes. Ports unloaded cargo with industrial regularity. Nothing here was heroic, and that was the point. While Axis production struggled with bottlenecks, specialized parts, limited alloys, skilled labor shortages, American industry absorbed friction without collapsing. Losses at the front did not echo backward into the system. They were isolated events. This is where inevitability begins to take shape. In Germany, a destroyed aircraft meant pilot loss, machine loss, fuel loss, training loss, all tied together. In the United States, these elements were separated. Pilots trained independently, aircraft were built independently, fuel was shipped independently. The system did not rely on a single chain, it relied on parallel chains. As the war progressed, this temporal gap widened. Enemy planners reacted to destruction, American planners scheduled around it. The result was not just numerical superiority, it was temporal dominance. The side that replaces faster does not need perfect strategy. It only needs time. And time, by 1942, was no longer neutral. It had already chosen a side. In most wars, losses spread. A destroyed vehicle affects training. A lost pilot affects morale. A damaged factory affects supply. These effects move backward through the system, slowing everything behind them. In World War II, this is how Axis economies behaved. Damage at the front echoed into the rear. The American system was built differently. Losses were contained. When an aircraft was destroyed in combat, nothing upstream needed to change. Factories did not slow down. Training schedules did not pause. Fuel shipments did not reroute. The system assumed loss as a constant variable. This was not optimism, it was accounting. American planners separated war into independent processes. Aircraft production did not depend on pilot survival. Pilot training did not depend on aircraft availability. Fuel supply did not depend on operational success. Each process continued on its own timeline. This separation mattered more than numbers. In Germany, production, training, and deployment were tightly coupled. When one failed, the others followed. A bombing raid could delay production. That delay reduced available aircraft. Fewer aircraft meant fewer experienced pilots. The system contracted inward. In the United States, contraction did not occur. Factories produced regardless of combat outcomes. Training bases operated far from threat. Logistics routes remained intact. Distance played a role, but structure mattered more. The American mainland was not just safe, it was organizationally insulated. War losses occurred thousands of kilometers away from the mechanisms that replaced them. This created a one-directional flow. Equipment moved toward the front. Losses did not move back. By 1943, this asymmetry was no longer theoretical. Axis planners faced a system where every successful interception produced a local result, but no strategic effect. Destroying an aircraft removed one unit. It did not slow the rate at which the next one arrived. At that point, air war logic begins to fail. If destruction cannot influence production, then production becomes the dominant force. And the side with the deeper system does not need to win exchanges. It only needs to outlast the attempt to stop it. This is when war stops being a contest of skill and becomes a contest of structure. One side adapts to losses, the other absorbs them. In most wars, losses spread. A destroyed vehicle affects training, a lost pilot affects morale, a damaged factory affects supply. These effects move backward through the system, slowing everything behind them. In World War II, this is how Axis economies behaved. Damage at the front echoed into the rear. The American system was built differently. Losses were contained. When an aircraft was destroyed in combat, nothing upstream needed to change. Factories did not slow down. Training schedules did not pause. Fuel shipments did not reroute. The system assumed loss as a constant variable. This was not optimism, it was accounting. American planners separated war into independent processes. Aircraft production did not depend on pilot survival. Pilot training did not depend on aircraft availability. Fuel supply did not depend on operational success. Each process continued on its own timeline. This separation mattered more than numbers. In Germany, production, training, and deployment were tightly coupled. When one failed, the others followed. A bombing raid could delay production. That delay reduced available aircraft. Fewer aircraft meant fewer experienced pilots. The system contracted inward. In the United States, contraction did not occur. Factories produced regardless of combat outcomes. Training bases operated far from threat. Logistics routes remained intact. Distance played a role, but structure mattered more. The American mainland was not just safe, it was organizationally insulated. War losses occurred thousands of kilometers away from the mechanisms that replaced them. This created a one-directional flow. Equipment moved toward the front. Losses did not move back. By 1943, this asymmetry was no longer theoretical. Axis planners faced a system where every successful interception produced a local result, but no strategic effect. Destroying an aircraft removed one unit. It did not slow the rate at which the next one arrived. At that point, air war logic begins to fail. If destruction cannot influence production, then production becomes the dominant force. And the side with the deeper system does not need to win exchanges. It only needs to outlast the attempt to stop it. This is when war stops being a contest of skill and becomes a contest of structure. One side adapts to losses, the other absorbs them. In war, distance is usually a problem. It stretches supply lines and slows response. For the United States in World War II, distance did the opposite. American factories were not near the front. They were not even near the war. Between production and destruction lay oceans, continents, and infrastructure depth. that could not be meaningfully attacked. German and Japanese planners understood this. They simply could not change it. Bombing works when destruction travels backward into the system. When factories are close, when transport nodes are few, when production is concentrated. American production violated all three conditions. Factories were spread across thousands of kilometers. Rail networks offered redundancy. Ports were numerous, not singular points of failure. There was no center to strike. Even successful attacks could not scale. A damaged facility did not reduce national output. It merely shifted load elsewhere. This is what depth looks like in practice. A German factory destroyed meant months of lost output. An American factory slowed meant a schedule adjustment. The war never reached the mechanisms that mattered most. While Axis industry operated under constant threat, American industry operated under planning assumptions. Nothing had to be hidden. Nothing had to be dispersed in haste. Nothing had to be rebuilt under pressure. Distance gave time. Time preserved structure. As the war progressed, this gap widened. Axis forces were forced to defend production and fight simultaneously. The United States did not. Every bomb dropped on Europe forced trade-offs. Every bomb dropped on the Pacific changed nothing at home. By 1943, the imbalance was absolute. One side fought inside the war, the other fought outside it, feeding it resources. This is when inevitability becomes irreversible. You cannot defeat what you cannot reach, and you cannot exhaust what continues to function untouched. The front lines moved, the factories did not, and the war followed the factories, not the armies. Strategic bombing is often described as the decisive force of the war. Fleets of aircraft, cities burning, industrial targets erased. But bombing only works if destruction changes behavior. It must slow production. It must reduce replacement. It must force a system to adapt downward. Against the United States, none of this happened. American factories did not react to bombing results. They reacted to plans. Production targets were set in advance. Schedules assumed losses. Output curves ignored combat reports. Bombers could destroy what already existed. They could not affect what was already scheduled. This is the core asymmetry. When Allied bombers struck German industry, production fragmented. Facilities moved underground. Skilled labor scattered. Output stagnated under pressure. When Axis forces destroyed American equipment, nothing equivalent followed. No factories relocated. No production lines halted. No emergency improvisation was required. Losses were absorbed, not answered. By 1944, this difference was visible everywhere. The Allies planned operations based on expected attrition and proceeded anyway. Axis planners attempted to conserve strength and fell behind regardless. One side fought battles. The other side executed a timetable. This is why American factories were more dangerous than bombers. Bombers required perfect conditions: weather, navigation, protection. Factories required only continuity. They did not need victories. They did not need surprise. They did not even need efficiency in the narrow sense. They needed time, and time was guaranteed by distance, scale, logistics, and replacement speed. By the final years of the war, resistance no longer changed outcomes. It only changed casualty counts. The system was already complete. At that point, the enemy was not fighting for victory. They were fighting inside a process that no longer depended on them. The war did not end when armies collapsed. It ended when the imbalance became irreversible. Everything after that was delay. There is a moment in every industrial war when effort stops shaping results. Fighting continues. Losses continue. Operations continue. But outcomes no longer change. By late 1944, the United States had reached this point. American production had surpassed strategic necessity. More aircraft were built than could be immediately deployed. More vehicles arrived than units could absorb. This surplus is often misunderstood as inefficiency. In reality, it was systemic closure. Once replacement exceeds destruction by a wide margin, destruction loses meaning. Axis forces could still shoot down aircraft. They could still sink ships. They could still delay advances. But none of these actions altered the production curve. Every successful defense became temporary. Every tactical victory became irrelevant within weeks. This is the psychological break. When soldiers know that destroying equipment does not slow the enemy, combat stops being a contest. It becomes maintenance. The American system no longer reacted to the war. The war reacted to the American system. Operations were planned based on availability, not scarcity. Loss estimates no longer constrained action. This is why late-war Allied offensives look relentless rather than brilliant. They did not need finesse. They needed continuity. Meanwhile, the Axis faced the opposite condition. Every loss mattered more than the previous one. Every destroyed unit reduced future capability. Every delay tightened constraints. One side operated inside abundance, the other inside erosion. At this stage, surrender is not a moral decision. It is a recognition of structure. The outcome is no longer hidden. It is simply being processed. The war ends not when resistance collapses, but when resistance no longer interacts with the system producing the war. That moment occurred before the final battles. Everything afterward was motion without leverage. It is tempting to believe that the Axis could have matched American production with better decisions, more focus, more discipline, better planning. This assumption misunderstands the problem. The American system was not a technique. It was a pre-war condition. Mass production requires stability before conflict begins. Factories, labor pools, transport networks, and capital must already exist at scale. Germany and Japan entered the war without this foundation. German industry was optimized for quality, not throughput. Its production was fragmented across specialized firms. Standardization came late and under pressure. Attempts to centralize production occurred while factories were already under attack. Japan faced even harsher limits: scarce raw materials, limited industrial base, long maritime supply lines vulnerable to interdiction. No level of tactical brilliance could fix this. Even if Germany had reorganized earlier, even if Japan had avoided certain strategic errors, neither could create continental-scale industrial depth during an active war. The United States did not build its system in response to the conflict. It revealed it. Civilian consumption had already trained the economy for mass output. Automobiles, appliances, and infrastructure projects created habits of scale. War merely redirected them. This is why imitation failed. You cannot standardize under bombardment. You cannot expand logistics while losing access to fuel. You cannot train millions of workers while your cities shrink. By the time Axis planners recognized the gap itself had become self-sustaining. More American production enabled more protection of shipping. More shipping enabled more raw materials. More materials enabled more production. A closed loop. Germany and Japan operated inside open loops, vulnerable at every point. This is not a story of missed opportunities. It is a story of constraints. Some systems cannot be caught up to. They must be confronted early or not at all. By 1942, that window had already closed. The war continued. The outcome did not. Wars are often described as sequences of choices. Commanders decide, governments respond, outcomes shift. This model breaks down in industrial war. At a certain scale, decisions stop shaping results. They only manage consequences. For World War II, that moment arrived earlier than most accounts admit. By 1942, American production was no longer catching up. It was accelerating beyond strategic necessity. Aircraft output increased faster than losses could accumulate. Shipbuilding outpaced sinkings. Training capacity exceeded deployment limits. From this point on, the war entered a different phase. Axis leaders could still choose how to fight. They could not choose whether to keep up. Even perfect tactical execution could only slow the imbalance. It could not reverse it. This is the defining feature of the point of no return. When replacement exceeds destruction permanently, attrition ceases to be reciprocal. One side bleeds, the other sheds. By 1943, evidence of this was visible across every theater. The Battle of the Atlantic turned not on tactics, but on shipyard output and escort availability. The air war over Europe shifted when losses no longer constrained bombing schedules. In the Pacific, American naval losses became operational data, not strategic crises. None of these moments were decisive alone. Together, they closed the system. After this, resistance no longer affected structure. It only affected duration. The Axis continued to fight because fighting was still possible, not because victory remained achievable. This distinction matters. Wars do not end when defeat becomes inevitable. They end when defeat becomes undeniable. Between those 2 points lies delay, measured in lives, not outcomes. The factories had already made the decision. Everything else was implementation. World War II is usually remembered through moments. Battles, landings, decisions made under pressure. These moments feel decisive because they are visible. Systems are not. Factories do not charge. Logistics do not inspire. Schedules do not bleed. And yet they decide outcomes long before the shooting stops. This is why the war is often misread. We focus on tactics because tactics can change a day. We focus on leaders because leaders make visible choices. But industrial war is indifferent to visibility. The American advantage did not appear suddenly. It did not depend on brilliance. It did not require perfection. It required continuity. Factories that kept running. Logistics that assumed loss. Replacement that treated destruction as data, not disaster. By the time the war reached its most dramatic moments, the underlying balance had already hardened. Victory did not arrive, it unfolded. This perspective is uncomfortable. It suggests that courage can be insufficient. That skill can be overwhelmed. That effort can be rendered irrelevant by structure. But it also explains something important. Why overwhelming force appeared late. Why resistance continued after hope was gone. Why the end felt sudden, even though it had been prepared for years. The war was not decided by the best move. It was decided by the system that could afford mistakes. Bombers destroyed targets. Factories destroyed possibilities. And once that difference existed, the rest of the war was not a struggle for victory. It was a struggle against inevitability.